Hello folks, Darrel Smith from South Dakota again. Well, I've told quite a few of my stories, and I guess I'm just kind of disappointed in my delivery. I've always wanted to be a good storyteller, and I just don't have the traits, I guess. But I'm going to do the best I can, so hang with me. In flight operations from aircraft carriers, when planes are flying inland and across the beach, headed toward a target, they make a feet dry call indicating that they're over land and proceeding toward the target. On the return, as they cross that same beach, as they get over water, they make a feet wet call indicating that the mission is complete. They're over water and they're returning to the ship. I'd been in Vietnam for a year. It was long. It was not fun. I was flying quite often, which flying is good. The flying was good, but the rest of it, the living conditions and the whole show was not good. But I was finished. I had lived. I had spent a year there, had flown my combat missions, but was still alive. So my next job was to get back to the United States. The normal way to do that was from July, we would fly to Da Nang, and then possibly from Da Nang all the way to Hawaii on a leased commercial plane, or we might go to Okinawa and fly through Hawaii. But it happened a different way for me. At that time, 214, VMA 214, which is the famous World War II squadron, Pappy Boyington was the leader of it. They called him Pappy because he was like 8 years older than the next younger guy. But anyway, they made that squadron famous, and there was even a TV show about that. So 214 had been flying over there, and they had their aircraft were in the point where they needed to be replaced. And so they needed to get those airplanes back to the United States. Well, they were going to do that by flying them, of course. Well, they chose me. Somehow it just happened to be my time in country had run out, and it was time for me to go home. So they thought it was logical that I would fly one of the airplanes, or at least help fly the airplanes back to the States. Well, I said we didn't fly any more combat missions, or I didn't. We did do testing on those aircraft. They put long-range fuel tanks on them, and we did what we called practicing being miserable. We flew, climbed to altitude, and just sat there and drive back and forth up and down the coast, burning fuel and making sure all the fuel tanks and transfer systems worked. A lot of times after those flights, we would join up with refueling aircraft and practice our skills at refueling, because that would be required on several occasions. Well, the day finally came for us to leave. We got up, had a little breakfast, got in our full flight gear, and then nothing. The fog was so thick you couldn't even see across the street. So we sat there and waited, and eventually the fog did start to lift, and we were given the order to man our aircraft and get on our way. So on that particular day, we took off to the south on my run. It was a north-south runway, and we took off to the south. And I believe I'd flown off of that runway for a year, and I think that's the only time I ever took off to the south. Maybe I did it before, but I don't remember it. Well, the aircraft started to roll down the runway, picked up speed normally. It seemed like it was running just fine. Airspeed got to the proper position. I rotated, and the little jet lifted off, and I sucked the gear up and did a turn out over the South China Sea, and I looked back over my shoulder and I said, "Black sheep, feet wet. Goodbye, Vietnam." I didn't say it out loud. I just said it in my head, but I was glad to be away from that place. Well, it's about 600 miles to the Philippines, and we were on our way to Guam for our first leg. It's about 600 miles of open water to the Philippines. We took on fuel one time over the Philippines, and it's a long leg, but only one refueling was required since we did have the Philippines as a divert station. So we overflew the Philippines, found the tankers, and flew to Guam. We landed at Anderson Air Force Base and parked near the water. We could see the water from where we parked at the north end of the island of Guam. Well, the whole crew was happy to be out of Vietnam, and some of the guys did a bit too much celebrating at the O Club that night. And our CO heard about it, and he wasn't very happy. So the idea had been that there were more pilots than there were aircraft. So we were going to share the flying. The pilots not flying would fly in the tankers, which was another boring trip, and while others flew the aircraft. Well, the next morning after their little partying, the CO told me, our operations officer informed me that I'd be flying one of the aircraft over to Wake Island was our next stop. That's not a long distance, but we didn't have to refuel at all. And it turns out that I flew one of the aircraft all the way from Vietnam to El Toro in California. It was an uneventful flight over to Midway. I don't remember any part of it. I do know that the island is a horseshoe-shaped island. It has the living quarters on one end of it, and the runways on the other leg of it. And within hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, there was an attack on Midway, and the Japanese made a surprise bombing run just like they had done in Hawaii. Well, there were about 500 Marines on the base and about 100 civilians. The Japanese attacked and tried an amphibious landing, and they were handed their first defeat of the war. The Marines turned them back. And, however, they reinforced, got more planes, more people, and they did another attack, which was successful. They had 14, I believe, was the number of Marine aircraft there, and that was squadron 121, 211. I believe it was 211, and that I flew some of their aircraft, that squadron aircraft, while I was in Vietnam. By the way, all those 14 airplanes were eventually destroyed, but not before they had punished the Japanese severely. 2 large ships were sunk and a lot of people were killed. The Marines from that attack were transported to Japan and put in prisoner of war camps, and they stayed there for the duration of the war. The civilians that were on Wake Island, the Japanese used them as slave labor for a while, and then marched them across the island and executed them, shot them all. So anyway, we learned all that by a young enlisted Navy guy got an automobile and toured several of us around the island. Well, our next leg was from Wake Island to Marine Corps Air Station Kaneohe in Hawaii. Was one, if I remember, maybe 2 refuelings required. We'd get airborne and they'd top us off, and then a little later they'd top us off again, and we'd had enough fuel to make it, but didn't have a lot of extra fuel. So we were flying, and as my major was leading my flight, I was the second section leader, And he was doing all the communications, of course. And when we reached, we got into contact with approach control or air traffic control down in Hawaii. The major decided he wanted to bring, and he said this over the radio, these boys have been in combat and I want to bring them home in style. So he requested permission to descend over the ocean. And so there we were, 100 or more miles from our air base, burning fuel like mad. The jets burn a lot more fuel down low. And we're just a few feet off the water. And it was nice to do that. You know, it's kind of fun to flat out like that. But we had just had a year of combat, and we were diving at the ground day after day and flying at night. We did not need any more excitement. However, he wanted to do it, and he did it. Well, as we approached the air station, he called us into signal for us to join him in close formation, and we did that. When you're flying formation, you've got to concentrate on the aircraft that you're flying formation on, because any move on him, you've got to move too, and it's hard to keep it right there, or it's demanding to keep it right there. So we were coming in a VFR landing, and we could not turn our heads to look, but out of the peripheral vision, we saw a very steep mountain with a lot of vegetation on it, and it was close. And that was enough to unnerve us a little bit. But the next move turned our little group into, rather than bring us home in style, turned into a gaggle. And a gaggle has been defined by a gaggle is an undisciplined group of aircraft milling about in roughly the same piece of sky, sometimes attempting to impersonate a formation. Well, we turned into a gaggle. We saw the mountain, and that was unnerving enough. And then he brought us into the break. And what you do on the break is everybody's the same speed, and you're going right down the runway. And one at a time, we do a hard turn, usually to the left, and then you're a single plane. You configure aircraft and come around to land. But as and it's important for the lead to be steady and flying straight ahead. Well, we got in the proper position. He pulled power off and so there we all three other airplanes trying to accommodate him, pulling the power back. And we, like I said, we turned. I was not very proud. We turned into a gaggle. We didn't look like combat hardened, trained pilots. Well, Hawaii is a great place. I can tell you that when I parked that airplane and popped that canopy open, the smell, it was the aroma, the flower smell, whatever it was magnificent. And the warm air on my face and the puffy white clouds in the sky and the green. I tell you what, I cannot explain the feeling that I felt. It was a wonderful thing to get my feet on U.S. soil again. But we had a day off in Hawaii, and we toured the island a little bit, went up to the Pali Lookout. Wind blows up there. It's kind of funny. You get a certain place, you get up there, and your wind blows. You can lean into the wind at a pretty good angle and still stand up. Well, we had one leg to go. And I should say, maybe, I don't know which leg it was. We had a flight surgeon that was traveling along with us. And I was getting on my aircraft, and I assume he did the same thing. He handed me a little pill, and he said, "Take that before you take off." And I did. I don't have any idea what it was, but it was some sort of narcotic. And I remember out over the ocean, you could see as far as you could see blue. I was comfortable. I was warm. I can't sing, but I was singing, and I remember saying, "Just give me some gas. I'll fly this little sucker all the way around the world." It was a happy thing. but it was I had to pay for that, and I stayed away from drugs as always my life, but certainly would not consider it after that. I felt so bad after we landed. Oh, I had a real downer, I guess, or whatever. Anyway, I didn't feel good, so I don't want any more medicine to help me stay alert. Okay, we're on our last legs. We're going to El Toro, which is a station south of Los Angeles, and but it's open water all the way, no divert station. So 3 refuelings were required. And what happened was we took off and climbed altitude and then refueled. We flew farther ahead and met the tankers again and then refueled. At both of those refuelings, if something had happened where we couldn't take on fuel, we had enough to get back to Hawaii. So after that second fueling, we had time enough fuel to reach across most of the ocean. The third refueling was the tankers came out from El Toro out over the water to meet us, and we rendezvoused with them, and we were all happy. And the major's still leading, and the major said, "Give us 2,000 pounds each." Well, even the tanker pilot said, "Hey, I got all the fuel you need. Take all you need." Nope, 2,000 pounds. And that was enough to get us there, but it wasn't a big margin of safety. I started to ask for another 1,000 pounds, but I didn't. Anyway, we made it just fine, but when we got to El Toro, again, the major wanted to bring his boys home in style, lined us up in formation and flew right down the runway. It was easy to get lined up with that runway. Right down the runway, and he, as I've described a brake before, he did not pull power this time. He did a hard brake to the left. However, we did not know, and he didn't tell us, that halfway down the runway was a fog bank. And as soon as he did his brake away from the flight, we flew into clouds. We couldn't see anything. And there we were at low altitude, 1,000 feet. In the clouds at full speed. It turned into another gaggle. Anyway, we were able to fly our aircraft out of the fog and make successful landings. It had rained on the base recently, and this is my excuse. The other guys didn't, and I did. But this is my excuse. There were puddles on the runway. At that time, the A4 did not have anti-skid brakes. They later put it on. You didn't have nose wheel steering either. They later put it on. But I was braking across one of these puddles, and my tire, one of the main tires, stopped rotating, which is hydroplaning, and it stopped rotating. And when I had the brake on, and when we came out of the puddle onto dry concrete, that tire popped like a balloon. It was embarrassing. I had been flying for a full year in Vietnam under any and all conditions and had never blown a tire. And here I was in California with a blown tire. Well, that was the last flight I ever had on the A4. I was tired, and everybody else was, and we were issued rooms at the BOQ and given airline tickets and told when we were to meet a cab to take us to the airport. And we all did. We changed into civilian clothes. They suggested we do that because the anti-war riots were going on at that time, and it'd be better just to be a civilian. Anyway, I met the cab, and he jumped in the back seat, and he took off to the airport, and I can't really explain it. Just outside the gate, it was a shock. It just was a shock. There were tree-lined streets with palm trees. It was all clean. People were walking around in clean clothes, in shorts, and they were laughing. And I wanted to shout, "Hey, there's a war going on. People are being killed." But it was not a factor. It was like within a couple of days, I had just left the place, and all night long you could hear bombs going off in the distance, and hear around the perimeter of the base there were flares. It was kind of a muffled explosion, and these flares would fly way in the air and come down by parachute to keep people to guard the perimeter so we could be safe. It was a war going on, and all at once, it wasn't. It was a shock. It was a real shock. And I can tell you, well, I can't tell you because I don't know how to explain it, but I went ahead and got a flight, and it was from Los Angeles to Memphis, Tennessee. And my wife and mom and dad were there to meet me at the airport. Kind of makes me emotional right now. And again, Glenda and I stood looking at each other, face to face. I can't explain the feeling. That's my story for today. Thank you.